Welcome to Essential Leadership Skills with TEDx speaker Sejals TED. Bias in the workplace can be a very costly issue. Wouldn't it be great to have a plan to help erase bias starting with yourself? Is that even possible? Join Glenn Daniels for an important conversation with our guest Sejals TED. Dubbing herself Chief Civility Officer, Sejals is not your average employment law attorney. Her more than 17 years of experience advising clients regarding sound and standard employment practices uncovered a need and personal passion for bringing more proactive, relevant, and impactful workplace training programs to her clients and their teams. Her highly experiential customized workshops tailored to bring the courtroom to the training room in an interactive, engaging environment that favors human stories over compliance checklists.
This is a Touchstone Publishers presentation, your trusted source of leadership knowledge.
Well, good morning, everyone. And we had a talk about this earlier on. No matter what time of day it is, it's always morning for me because I have that energy and I can perform a little bit better when I think it's first thing in the morning, no matter if it's 10 o'clock at night. So it's always good morning. So I want to welcome our guests. As you have noticed, ladies and gentlemen, of late, we've been having world-class thought leaders, world-class TEDx speakers on our show to help us all become better leaders. And my understanding is a lot of you are sharing this with your leadership team and your direct reports. So continue to do that. Let's make sure that we are getting to the right spot. Sejals, is that right?
Sejals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sejals. Okay, Sejals. Welcome. Thank you very much for hanging out with us today. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, hopefully we're going to have a great show. It's always been fun to me. But I do have my very first question queued up, ready to go for you. I'd like for you to let me know and the audience know what is unique and powerful about either your TED Talk, your organization, or yourself. What's unique and powerful that you think people should know about that maybe they don't really know about?
Yeah, I would say, my TEDx talk is very unique. And I think it's something that everybody needs to watch and learn from. I was inspired to do that talk because in my training work that I do a lot of training on unconscious bias and microaggressions. And when I was doing this work, I realized that the word bias in and of itself causes disconnect in people. And I believe that it's impossible to get to true inclusion until we all understand what our own unconscious biases are so that we can mitigate any harmful effects that can result. So the TEDx talk really looks at bias from 3 different perspectives and provides some simple strategies to help you mitigate your bias so that it doesn't impact your relationships with other people.
Yeah, we're going to really jump down into that too. And by the way, I want to ask you about the talk, the pain, power, and paradox of bias. I want to ask you about that. But before we get into that a little bit, we want to understand your story, how you got from the time you decided that you wanted to do this, got inspired, to what that journey was to the stage. I mean, what was that like to stage? Now, you were the first person I've had on that actually was able to record yours, right, at home because of our pandemic. Everybody else has been in front of an audience, but still. Tell us about that journey from the time you got inspired to do it to the time you did it.
So, being on TEDx, like for most people, was something that was on my bucket list, right? I'm going to get to it someday. I really wasn't thinking about doing it last year with the pandemic, with everything going on. And one of my LinkedIn connections, she actually helps people land a TEDx talk. And she had seen one of the videos that I put out there. And she said, you need to do a TEDx talk. And so she saw something in me before I did. And I remember the first conversation with her. I was like, I am trying to survive the pandemic. Like, I am not thinking about the TEDx talk. That's back there somewhere. But she said, no, I really think what you're talking about is relevant. People need to hear about it. And so we applied. And initially, when I did get accepted, Glenn, actually, I was supposed to do it on stage. They had expected that probably nobody would be in the audience, but at least I would get to be up on that stage. And then, it wasn't safe and they felt that it was better to just record it. So I ended up actually, again, just the universe helped me because I had a colleague that had professional photographers that were going to be recording some videos on site. And so she offered to record it for me. So I was really grateful for that somebody was able to help me out like that.
Yeah, that is very helpful, and I'm glad they found a way to do that, even though it might not have been safe to travel and to journey so in every place. The follow-up question I have to that: how difficult was it for you to take your message and put it into 18 minutes? I mean, you're just delivering the idea; you're not really giving the thought and everything behind it. But how difficult was that?
It was hard. It was really difficult, actually, because I mean, I've been training and educating for numbers of years, but doing something like this when you're actually having to tell a story, and especially, make it resonate with people on video, putting down the actual words. So you have to actually write down your entire script, which is something I never do. Even with my training work, I have bullet points, and then I just sort of free go for it, right? So that was really, really difficult. I must have rewritten my script at least 100 times, where I would just think I've got it, and then a day goes by, and then I'm like, no, I want to switch this, I want to move this around. So it was really a hard process. And then the other part of it that was really tough too was memorizing the script, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
again, I don't have a great memory where some people could just read it and then have it. I had to go over and over again, and the topic was heavy, so that also was something that I had to get comfortable with and doing all of that. So I realized that there's a lot that goes into doing a TEDx talk. When you just watch the final product, you're like, oh yeah, that seems easy, but a lot goes into that. I would say I spent about 3 months from start to finish, really preparing, writing out the script, memorizing, and then finally recording it.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. And thank you for sharing that backstory.
Yeah.
I want to dive just a little bit into your TED Talk, but I kind of want to hit it differently than what you presented it. I want to ask you, the first thing I want to ask you about is your definition of bias. You presented a different definition, said this is the current definition for bias, and maybe we should look at it this way.
Yeah. Yeah. So bias is, and again, this word has just become so used in when you associate that word, it's got a negative connotation to it. But really, when you look at the definition of the word bias, it just means preference, one thing over another, right? It just means that when we as human beings, it's in our natural state that when we're presented with two options, we're naturally going to prefer one over the other, whether it's a positive preference or a negative preference. It's going to have some sort of preference. So that's really all bias is, right? And so when I was doing these trainings, I realized the minute I would even say the word, people would start to disconnect. So what I started doing in my trainings is I started replacing the word bias with the word belief. So instead of talking about it as unconscious bias, I started referring it to as unconscious beliefs. And I saw that people were reacting totally differently, and everything else was the same. And so that really was the inspiration for the TEDx talk, that I was like, I need to get on a TEDx and I need to educate people and raise awareness on this issue, because we really need people to start understanding what their own biases are. And so I wanted to kind of normalize that conversation around bias, to say, look, if you have a brain, you have bias. It's normal. It's not something that, you're trying to get rid of. It's really just understanding what your own bias is so that you can then implement strategies to mitigate that bias.
So a lot of this belief systems that people have, or bias, as something that's genetic, kind of not genetic, but kind of been brought on and trained in them since their early life. And oftentimes we don't realize that that's our belief systems.
Yeah.
But I found something else you said kind of interesting that really drove this point home, even on a deeper level, and that is thinking is not the full answer.
That's right.
If we want to end bias, it's not just thinking, thinking I want to be better. I don't want to feel that way.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So I want to give just a little bit of background on the biology of how we have these so bias.
Perfect.
Okay. Bias could be conscious bias or it could be unconscious bias, right? Okay. So there's a distinction there. Conscious bias is when you're aware that you have a certain feeling towards somebody. Again, it could be positive bias or it could be negative conscious bias, right? So for example, if I saw somebody that looks like my son, I might have a positive feeling towards that person because they remind me of my son. So I have a positive bias towards that person. Right. Now, That's a conscious bias because I love my son, and anybody that knows me knows that I love my son. So I am aware of that bias. So why is that important? Well, if I was hiring somebody, right, and two people walk in and one looks like my son, if I'm not aware of that bias, I might let that unintentionally impact my decision making. So there's conscious bias and unconscious bias. Now, going to the biology part of the unconscious bias, and I talk about this in my TEDx talk as well, is that our brain processes so much information that's constantly coming at us. So our unconscious bias is really a survival mechanism. Our brain engages in certain complicated pattern recognition systems. It files all this information away into our brain. And so when we see somebody for the first time, based on our own lived experience, we're going to make some assumptions about that person unconsciously, not knowing it. So that's the unconscious part. And that's really what I'm focusing in on in my TEDx talk. I talk about, why it's important to understand that, because when you have unconscious bias, it comes out in what you say and what you do without you even knowing it. So it has nothing to do with intention. It's not about whether you're a good person or a bad person. It's strictly biology. And since each of us have gone through something different, all of our biases are going to be different, right? Conscious and unconscious.
Right. Mm-hmm. So when you tell the story about yourself and going to lunch and that nasty note on your locker, I mean, my first thought was, well, whoever wrote it, they need to go back to their home country too, because unless you're Native American, this is not your country either. Right. We don't want to go there. But that was my first thought. And that was a bias reaction, right? Yeah. That was my bias. Whoever wrote that, just go back to your own country. Yeah. Okay. But your reaction, I guess when you went to go beat, the girl said something else, and you try to beat her half to death. I guess it took 3 people to stop you. That was bias too, right? That was
that's the point, right? Is that we go through different lived experiences, and that's going to impact how we view the world. That's normal. That's how it is. Even to this day, Glenn, if I see somebody that's Italian, I get a physical reaction, even though that happened years ago, right? I still feel that effects. My heartbeat starts to rate, my palms get sweaty. There is nothing I can do about that. That's normal because of what I went through. Now I've done the work to recognize that I have that bias so that I can check it at the door. And that's really the whole point of the TEDx talk, is to help people understand that, look, it's normal. If you've gone through certain situations, of course that's going to impact your beliefs, right? Yeah, of course it is. And so, but if you don't do the work to understand what those unconscious biases are, then you go on autopilot and you're making all these decisions that can harm other people, right? So a lot of it is good. We don't want to think about every single decision we make, right? We'd be overwhelmed. It'd be too much. But when you're making important decisions, you want to make sure you're deliberate. And so like you have here, it says thinking is not the full answer. Absolutely. That's a start though. Because if you think about unconscious bias and conscious bias, in a lot of ways, it's a difference in speed. We're just trying to slow down our reaction time to these initial spontaneous judgments that we make. So slowing down, and that's the acronym that I talk about in my talk, is the HAT acronym.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. That I found that to be extremely powerful, to slow that process down. I do want to just comment on something that you said that hit me. It was so true, and I'm laughing as you said. When we did our 40th high school reunion, my friend who I've known since high school, we are all at the same table, and we said if this one particular guy shows up, I said, I'm going to kick his you-know-what. He bullied us throughout bullied me throughout junior high school and high school. Okay, and now that, the tables are turned, I said, I'm going to beat the living daylights out of him if he shows up. My friend said, yeah, me too. After you finish my term. We were a little bit serious about it. Because like you said, you don't forget.
You don't forget.
And that created a bias, So you don't forget that created a belief system. And fortunately for him, he didn't show up. He decided.
Lucky him.
Because I think he had a list of like 20 people who were looking for him. And I was like, yeah, come on over here if you want to. But you had to deal with that. And for people of more color than less color, we always have to deal with that bias that comes out kind of negative. So you said this, and I found it kind of interesting. It's part of this hat process.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about that. Tell us, I mean, this is your process for handling bias, I think. And
Yeah,
it sounded like a pretty good one. So go ahead.
it's a good strategy. It's good enough for people to get started with right away. So, I'm a very visual person. And so I talk about a HAT acronym. So it makes sense, right? The hat sits on top of our brain, which is where the bias originates. So I thought it made sense. And so the acronym HAT stands for, the H is for hold off, right? So when you meet somebody new, instead of responding to your initial reactions about that person, really slowing down and really asking yourself, is this just my subjective perceptions? We're creatures of habit. Why am I making these initial judgments about this person that I just met? And so really about holding off, like creating that pause. And then the A stands for ask why. Asking yourself why you're making these judgments about this person, and then really going deep. And sometimes this is a lifelong process. I mean, I teach in this area and I'm still doing the work every single day, and I'm learning about more and more biases, right? Because
Right.
there's so many. And I mean, neuroscience has come a long way over the last decade. They've identified close to 200 cognitive biases that exist out there. So it's, each one of us is unique in that way. So it's asking why am I thinking this way? And then taking action, right? And so there I talk about the distinction between, look, do something to rewire, to retrain your brain. You can do it. It's not like you have to be stuck with certain biases or beliefs. You can, as human beings, we can rewire our brain. It just requires some conscious effort and inclusive behaviors. So I talk a little bit about the golden rule versus the platinum rule. And, I think a lot of us, when we grew up, we grew up with the golden rule, which is let's treat others in the ways that we want to be treated. Right. And the problem with that is not everybody wants to be treated the way that we want to be treated. Right. So I suggest that instead of the golden rule, that we follow the platinum rule, which is treat people in the way that they want to be treated. And the only way you can do that is by making time to actually get to know people, to connect with people, rather than disconnect because of these unconscious biases.
Good
So
ask.
that's a little bit about the strategies you can use to help you mitigate your bias.
Now, I was a little bit trying to get a handle on this because you also talked about 7 seconds. Is that the 7 seconds of the H, or is that something different?
So 7 seconds is, our brains are hardwired, and research shows that every human being, when you see somebody that you are not familiar with, right away, our brain automatically makes 11 judgments about them.
That's okay.
Within the first 7 seconds of meeting them. And then you end up looking for information, you end up looking for facts to confirm those 11 judgments, whether or not they're accurate or not about that person. For the rest of the time you know them, you're sitting there just looking for information to confirm your initial judgments that you made about this person. Even if you see evidence to the contrary, you will disregard that evidence and you want to try to confirm your own beliefs. And so that's called confirmation bias.
Right. Okay. Now I remember that, and that makes sense because what we're saying is 7 seconds. We've decided whether we like you or don't like you.
Right.
And instead of going through the hat process, hold off, ask, think. We hold on to that.
Right.
We hold on to that. You said you're working on this yourself all the time.
Yeah.
How do you get people to begin that process of working on it? I guess if they're contacting you, they want to begin the process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do training in this area, so I'm constantly doing workshops in this area, but I'll just give you 3 really easy tips for anybody that's watching this that you can start doing right now, right, to start learning about your own bias. And these are the techniques I talk about in my workshops that I do with people. One, it starts with self-awareness, right? It really starts with understanding your own bias. So there's an online tool called the Implicit Association Test. If you just type that into Google, it was an online tool. It's free. It was put together by Harvard University, psychologists from University of Virginia. University of Washington, and these psychologists came together and they put this test together. And I don't like calling it a test. I mean, that's what they called it. It's a tool. It's really an awareness tool, and it's broken out into different categories. So you can do like one to this week, one next week, just kind of break it out, and then it kind of lets you know what are your natural preferences in these categories. That's so valuable, because then again, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you're normal. But now you know that, hey, when I'm presented with two options, I have a tendency to lean in this direction, and you can use that information and make sure that you're making fair decisions. So that's one way. Another one is really, really simple. It's just to start observing these positive or negative reactions you have about people when you start to meet them. So really just becoming observant of your reactions. And again, regardless of whether it's positive or negative, just paying attention. Hey, I just met Sejal for the first time, and right away I was thinking this, and this about her. And you start paying attention to that, and you say, wait a second, why am I thinking that? Because again, and I talk about this in my TEDx talk, is research shows that our brain automatically, right away when we see somebody for the first time, we automatically look at their age, their gender, and their race. We're just hardwired to do that. Age, gender, and race. And then unconsciously, it will then associate those three characteristics with other characteristics like education, social status, and wealth. So without even knowing anything more, you've already decided where, my education level, my social status, and wealth. And this all happens unconsciously, right? So as you start becoming more observant of your reactions, you can start picking up on these trends, right? These habitual patterns that you engage in, and then you can start to mitigate those. And then the third tool is, again, very simple. This is what I mean. It's not that complicated, but because people don't understand it, it's something that they don't want to deal with because they've got this negative connotation associated with that word bias.
Right.
And then the third tool is just ask somebody. Ask somebody that you trust, that'll be brutally honest with you. Because here's the thing about unconscious bias. It's unconscious to us. It comes out in our actions, in our words, in the tone of our voice, in our facial, our hand gestures. It comes out. People that spend a lot of time with you, that, have your best interest at heart, just ask them. Hey, when I make important decisions, do you think I'm biased in any way? Right? And just be ready for the answer you get, because it'll tell you what your biases are. So there's 3 tools right there that you can use to help you understand what your biases are.
Wow. Let me ask you about our society, our culture. Are we feeding these biases to set us further apart somehow? The feed into them. So like you said, our brains look for confirmation all the time. But I'm saying, like, are we thinking about like TV shows, news reports, things like that are feeding the negative side of that bias?
Yeah. I mean, we saw a lot of that coming up last year, right? And social media just directing political views, race, absolutely. And that's where a lot of our lived experiences, that's what, it's all based on what we're exposed to. So, I mean, things down to social media, everything is controlled by other people, and we're only seeing what we're allowed to see, but we think that's the world, right? And so we can easily be manipulated by media, by social media, by the news, by politics, by people who have money, who control the information that we get access to. And that's why it's very important to, again, slow down our thinking and really make sure we're not responding to things, but we're really thinking it through and then taking action according to our current beliefs, whatever those are. Because the other thing that's important too is that as you start doing this work, you realize a lot of our unconscious beliefs are actually the opposite of what we currently believe. So a lot of these biases get lodged in our minds from what we've gone through in our life, but that may not be what we currently believe.
Well, with that conflict, what kind of happens?
It happens. It's very common. And that's what I'm saying. That's why it's important to do this work. So, for example, I was abused and harassed and bullied by Italian kids, right? As I just mentioned, to this day, I still have that reaction, that bias that pops up. That is very against what I believe. I'm talking out there about equality, about dignity and respect for all, yet I have this negative reaction. So that happens all the time. If something happened to you when you were a child, now you're still going to have that negative reaction, but you may not believe that now. You may have worked through it. You may understand that that has nothing to do with this person that's standing right here in front of me,
But the
right? And
bias is still
so
there, and you
the bias
worked
is
through it
still there.
intellectually.
Yeah,
Intellectually, you work through it,
yeah,
but it's still there. So you just
sure.
know you have to.
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
that's
here's
not
another
me.
example.
Yeah.
I'll just use my own examples, right? I have several tattoos, right? So I've got 3 tattoos myself. But even me with tattoos, when I see somebody covered from head to toe in tattoos, I'm like, wow, why would somebody do that? Like, I have a negative reaction. Now, I'm aware of that. And I'm like, wait a second, what are you doing? You have your own. So I can slow down the process. And a few seconds later, I'm like, that's cool. Like, that's up to them if they want it. But I have to work through that, even though the initial reaction may be negative, right? So it happens to all of us. It's normal.
Okay. Okay. So, and that's useful to know that you may have a negative
Yeah,
bias, but it doesn't match your current belief. That's
right.
useful to know, just so people can start paying attention to what they're doing and what they're thinking.
Hmm.
You also mentioned though, bias impacts us all.
Right.
On the surface, that seems duh, yeah, of course it does. But tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I mean, again, if you have a brain, it impacts us all in the same way, right? Because we are all going to make these automatic judgments about people. And so being aware of what your own tendencies are or preconceived notions are because of your own lived experiences of the worldviews that you've been exposed to can help you then mitigate those, right? But we all have bias, every single one of us. I remember one of the first trainings I did, somebody raised their hand and they said they didn't have bias. And I said, we have a lot of work to do because there are a lot of people that think they don't have bias, and it's just not true. It's normal. It's something because of our biology, with the way that our brain is wired, we all make these judgments. It's about figuring out what they are and then doing the necessary work. And it's ongoing work. It's not a one-time thing. It's not like you sit down, you do that test, and now you have it. This is how it works. Unfortunately, our lived experiences continue to change. We continue to grow. We evolve, and our biases do too, right?
Right, 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 right. Again, real quick, go back and tell us the tool that you mentioned. Is that on your website?
It's the implicit association test.
Okay, implicit association test. So
Yep,
just Google implicit association test.
exactly. Yep.
Okay, all right, and that is not currently on your website. That's you have to go there to get it.
Yeah, it's not on my website,
Okay,
but if you're on LinkedIn, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm constantly posting about that and other resources on these topics regarding the bias, regarding workplace culture. I'm always posting resources on all of these issues.
perfect. That's great. Absolutely great. 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 I would like to ask you about the pain paradox. Tell us about that. I understand it on maybe a real high level. So give me some details about that. Coach me on that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the talk, I look at bias from 3 different standpoints. One is the pain, one is the paradox, and one is the power of bias. And so the pain part of the talk is really just talking about my journey, where I grew up. We were the only Indian family in an all Italian neighborhood. So, like I was telling you earlier, I dealt with bullying and harassment. And so, there was an incident that I talk about that you alluded to earlier where, I dealt with a lot of bullying and harassment. I mean, my parents had accents, they barely spoke English, we had the darker skin, so one of the incidents I talk about in the pain part of the talk is when I was in high school, I found a note taped to my locker door that said, "Go back to your country." And at this point in my life, I was a normal teenager. I was acting out, I was fighting back. I found myself defending myself, which I should be anyway. And it just was a really sort of a dark period in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
at that time, and still to this day, we don't have a lot of resources for kids that are going through that, especially immigrant kids. There's really no one to talk to. There's no one at school. I mean, again, we were the only Indian family in this predominantly Italian neighborhood. So there's not a lot of resources. The only person I really had was my father. And even with him, these conversations would just be about, stop doing that. Otherwise you're going to get kicked out of school,
Yeah.
those kind of
Yeah.
conversations. And so he would always kind of tell me these, and I talk about this about, he would always give me a couple pieces of advice. Right. And he would say, Sejal, if people are hurting you, then they themselves are hurting inside. He would always tell me that. That's kind of a little bit starting to talk about the paradox of bias, is that bias isn't one dimensional. It impacts all of us, right? In one way or another, regardless of the side you're on, whether you're the victim or you're the one that's actually doing the harassment or bullying. So he would always say, if someone's hurting inside, then they hurt other people. And then he would always remind me that, look, we're all capable of being hurtful and harming other people. And so the paradox of bias was, he always let me know, like, this could be any one of us that is doing this to somebody else. And that's what he would tell me. And that really actually helped me kind of get through my teenage years, as I would find myself in these situations where I was like, I'm not going to become a victim to this circumstance. I'm going to figure out a way that I can help people who feel this way, who are going through this. And so that led to law school. And then I talk about, you would think most people, if they heard my story about what I went through growing up and they knew that I went to law school, they would probably expect that I would end up defending people who were being harassed.
That was a shock to hear that. So wait,
right.
Did I hear that right? Let me replay that.
And that's the twist in my story. That's the paradox where I talk about, now here I was representing people who were accused of harassing and bullying other people.
Yes.
Such a huge part of my story, because that is where I really had to deal with my own personal biases to be able to do the job and be an attorney and be successful at it. So I had to work through my own biases. But then I also saw a lot of people who were accused of harassing and discriminating. And there were, of course, there were some bad actors. So I'm not saying everybody was this way. There's always a few rotten apples, and I put them back there somewhere. But majority of the people that I was dealing with who were accused of harassing and discriminating were actually, I felt they were well-intentioned people. They just had these unconscious biases that maybe they weren't aware of, or they just needed education. They were ignorant. There was, lack of awareness, lack of education. Wow. So I found myself training a lot and educating a lot people on bias and these issues. And so that's the paradox of my story. And really the lessons that my dad was teaching me as I was growing up really started to come and really hit heavy, because I realized, like, wow, okay, they're just as much as a victim as I am of what I've gone through. And they were exposed to what they were exposed to. So they're also victims in this as well. And really helped me see it. And I think really helps me do the work that I do, because I can build those bridges a little bit easier because I've seen it from both ends.
So then that really does lay out the story of the pain paradox. I mean, it draws it all together. I mean, you're helping the people who are in pain. And the paradox is they're reaching out to hurt people sometimes and to create pain. But that's because they're in pain. That's interesting. And like I said, I was really shocked when you said you defend those folks. Wait a minute. But you have to listen to the whole thing. Talk to me about this inclusion versus exclusion kind of thought here. That you mentioned that in your TED Talk. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make the point that, we have choices we can make. And one of those choices is understanding our own biases, because if we understand them, then we can choose different behaviors. We don't have to act like just robots and go along with these automatic judgments that we're making about people. We can actually be very intentional in the choices that we make. And so I talk about, once you understand your bias, rather than it being a situation where you're deciding not to befriend someone or not to collaborate with somebody, not to work with somebody, you can choose inclusion. You can rewire your brain to say, you know what? No, I'm not going to let this automatic response impact my relationship with this person. You can practice inclusion with people, right? And that's really the whole reason why I wanted to do the talk, is that I've always felt like an outsider in my life because of what I've gone through. But that's also given me the ability to relate to other people who also feel like outsiders. And really, whether you feel like an outsider or not, the bottom line is we all want the same thing. We want to connect with one another. And using that HAT approach is one way that you can start to build meaningful relationships. But you have to make that choice. And the first thing is to commit to learning about your own biases, right?
Before we start to wrap up, I think it's important. So please cover HAT again for us. Just run the acronym out for us one more time, if you don't mind, please.
Sure, no. So HAT is for the H stands for hold off. So when you meet somebody, we know that our brain is going to automatically make these judgments about somebody. So hold off and put a conscious pause, right? And start observing why, that you're having these positive or negative reactions about someone. So hold off. And then the A is for ask why. Ask yourself why. Why am I making these judgments about them? And some of them you have to go really deep to, they're deeply ingrained in us, and like I said, I'm doing the work and I'm finding out new biases about me from way back then. And some of them were just shocking. Some of them you don't even know. It could be just something somebody has said, and now it's a bias it's a thought that you have in your head that you didn't even realize, And then the T is take action. And that goes back to what I explained earlier between the golden rule and the platinum rule. And do something about it so that you can retrain your mind, right? And it's totally possible to do that. And as long as you start to do this work, that's where you have the ability to make these choices, better choices. So it improves not just your life for yourself, but it improves life for everybody around you.
Yes, it does. It really does. It really does. I want to ask you, just start kind of wrapping up a little bit, but what did you learn? What happened with you? I mean, how did the TEDx talk affect you or your business?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'll tell you personally, it was a beautiful way to honor my father's legacy, right? I talk about him in there. I show his picture in there. I'm a daddy's girl. I lost him 9 years ago. So it's a wonderful way for me. It was a personal thing for me to share my story on this stage. It was also part of my healing journey, helped me heal. As I was going through this process, there were times where it was very vulnerable for me to share what I've gone through in my life like that, but I did it because I really wanted to honor his legacy. And also, I everything I do, Glenn, is because I want to help to create a better future for my son, and for other children out there. And I may never see the fruits of my labor while I'm alive, but I want to do my part so that it's better for them. And, I talk about him in the talk as well. He's 9. And I talk about, we used, the hat in our house. Like that's a staple. I'm always constantly reminding him of that and to say, and so, for me, it's like, I've done my part. It's been, the feedback I've gotten has been overwhelmingly positive from everybody. It has impacted people. My mission is accomplished. I really didn't have any other goals for, people do it for all different kinds of reasons for why they do the TEDx talk, but I have made an impact, a positive impact on people's lives. And it's beautiful to be able to help raise awareness on a topic that I'm so passionate about. I talk about, I do so many podcasts on this issue, and it's because I really think it's important for people to understand, especially with the kind of world that we all want. We don't want to live in what we've been experiencing, for the last 400 years or whatever. I think it needs to change, and it's going to change.
It has no choice.
It's changing already with these younger generations. My son's like, what? Why are people even, So it's going to happen, and I'm just doing my part. And that was the reason why I did the talk.
The pendulum is going to swing. My next question for you is, what are you doing right now to help people, to help us with this bias issue? What are you doing right now?
Yeah, is doing this podcast with you and having this conversation and sharing this information with the people in your network, right? That's what I'm doing. And I do a lot to raise awareness on this in the work that I do. I'm blessed because I get to do what I love for a living. So I get to talk about these topics that are important for me. I get to advocate for issues that resonate with my heart. And I just, I do something, I do it every day. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm out there inspiring, encouraging people to do this work because that's what we need to do in order for us to get to that place, which I want in my mind is dignity and respect for all of us. That's my goal.
All right. And I understand that completely, but I'm going to push the envelope here a little bit. Yeah. I want you to give us a commercial as to why people need to come to this website and start to work with you. I want you to tell us why they need to do it, what they're going to get from it, and how they do it, how they connect with you. So
absolutely. So what I do is I provide workshops on how to create better cultures. So it doesn't matter how many people you have. If you've got one person or 10 people, culture needs to be a priority. We spend way too much time at work to be miserable. So if you want help on creating better cultures where inclusion and belonging are a priority, where civility is something that you want to make sure it's the focus of your culture, so people know what is expected from them and what is going to happen if they don't align their behavior. Because at the end of the day, we can't change everybody's perspective. I can talk about this stuff till I'm blue in the face, but we can change behavior.
Yeah.
We can change behavior. And so my workshops are all about how do we create behavior change? Because research shows once we start to change behavior, then perception is also going to start to change as we do more of it through positive reinforcement. So if you want to work on your culture and you want to get it, it doesn't matter where you are in your journey. If you've done nothing with training your employees to you've tried everything and nothing's worked, I can help you address those issues.
Perfect. And they get a hold of you just through the website?
Yep. Or LinkedIn.
Or LinkedIn, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Last question, maybe, depending on what your answer is. And it's a hard one. I decided this is the hardest question, so my new rule is I don't tell anybody this question until I ask the question.
Okay.
So here we go. So what question should I have asked you that I did not ask you?
That you should have asked me. Yeah, you should have asked me what my number one job is.
Being a mom.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
Like my number one priority is being a mom and
being a dad on this end, yes.
Yeah.
And a granddad now, yes. Yep. Okay, so that was easy. So what's the other question I should have asked you?
Oh, what is something exciting that I'm doing right now that maybe not a lot of people know about?
Okay, tell us that. What are you doing right now that's exciting that people don't know about?
Really exciting. I recently accepted a part-time position of a chief culture officer position at a venture studio called Nobody Studios. Super exciting because now I basically get to walk my talk. I get to help create the strategies for culture at an organization from scratch, from ground up, working with our leadership team. Super exciting to be a part of that and to actually, walk my talk. I've been out there talking about civil cultures and now I get to help design it. So really excited about that opportunity.
Yeah. That is a great opportunity for you to prove, like you said, walk your talk, to prove the concepts and to help this company grow.
Exactly.
In the right way. Because it is about culture.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate it. I think we got a lot of good value from this list. I know I did. Made some great notes when I was sitting down and listening to the TEDx. So I'm going to suggest that everybody do that. Thank you. I appreciate you.
No, thank you again for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you for connecting with us here at Touchstone Publishers. Please join our group Essential Leadership Skills and share your leadership knowledge with us all.